Good evening, everyone, and a blessed and happy Palm Sunday to all the Orthodox Christians around the world. We wish happy Easter to all our brothers and sisters who are celebrating today. Today, we are joined for a wonderful conversation by Dr. John Fotopoulos. Dr. John, or a friend John, is an associate professor at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And he specializes in New Testament and early Christianity within the context of the Greco-Roman society and culture. He also the Patriarchate in the Order of St. Andrew, and his officium, or his title, is Teacher of the Gospel. And I suppose this is the most appropriate title for you, Professor, since this is what you do.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
So welcome this evening, friends. Just as in the past, you can feel free to write your questions. If there's something that you really want to ask the professor or me, feel free to do so in the comment area. And again, we invite everyone to consider making a contribution to our COVID-19 Parish Relief Fund by visiting chicago.goarch.org/donate. So, Professor, we're starting Holy Week, so this is, I think, the best time to speak to a professor of Scripture, of New Testament and early Christian studies, because we're going to be listening to wonderful hymns during the services. We will be reading passages from the Scriptures that are never read other than, Holy Week, or in their entirety. Other times are not read in their entirety other than Holy Week. And so it's wonderful for us to kind of maybe look at some of the details that are in these readings, and maybe we've never asked the question, or we just take some things for granted. So thank you again for joining us, and
Pleasure.
Kalidinami to you and your family.
Thank you.
So we're beginning. Obviously tonight is the first bridegroom story, and from tonight till Pascha, we are reliving and experiencing the passion of Christ, the crucifixion, the betrayal, the crucifixion, the death and burial of Christ, and then, of course, the glorious resurrection. So why don't we start from, right before Christ is arrested. Could you maybe tell us, we know that he's in the Garden of Gethsemane when he is arrested. Why is that significant? Why wasn't he arrested, let's say, in the city of Jerusalem?
That's a great question. Thanks, Your Eminence. It's wonderful to be with you and with all the viewers this evening. So I think maybe a little background would be helpful here. Gethsemane is located on the Mount of Olives, which is just adjacent to the old city of Jerusalem. So Jesus is there to celebrate the Jewish festival of Passover, the most important Jewish holiday of the year. And they would literally get hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims who would go to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival. They all couldn't stay in the city. There's just not enough room. So many of the pilgrims would camp outside of the city in the hills around the city, in this case on the Mount of Olives. So that's where Jesus and his disciples are kind of camping out while they're there for that week in Jerusalem.
So very, very similar to when people visit, let's say, a monastery, and there are thousands of pilgrims, or a church. I remember visiting St. John the Russian in Evia. People were just camping all over the town, various spots. It just happens that Jesus happens to be in Gethsemane.
Yes. So Gethsemane is probably an area on the Mount of Olives. So this word Gethsemane in Hebrew, it means olive press. There were a lot of olive trees there, hence the name, the Mount of Olives. So it's a place that would probably be a little cooler. There's probably a water supply. It's a good place to camp out, to get out of the busy city. Why wasn't Jesus arrested in the city? I think it's because the ruling authorities are very nervous about the crowds of people that just greeted Jesus a few days earlier in his entrance into Jerusalem. We're told in Mark's gospel, for example, that the authorities are afraid that there might be a riot among the people if they arrest him openly. So by getting him in Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, presumably the crowds would be asleep in the middle of the night. Jesus' closest disciples would be asleep. And so an arrest party can go by stealth, arrest Jesus, presumably, hopefully without any incident, without any trouble. And they could take him, bring him to the authorities, and get on with the process.
So can we add, I mean, again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but we just celebrated, the Saturday of Lazarus, the miracle. I mean, there are people who are watching and looking for Jesus. Is this kind of in line with that? They want to do it undercover, under the radar, and get them out of there and take them into their custody?
I think so. I mean, I think, we see all four Gospels the way that Jesus is greeted on what we call Palm Sunday today. And throughout the week, there's a lot of excitement that Jesus is Israel's long-awaited Messiah, the Davidic Messiah. And Jews had different ideas about what that meant. Some thought, a military king or some kind of a priestly leader or a prophetic leader. But many people were expecting some kind of a war, and maybe the Romans would be overthrown and the people of Israel would be free again and be able to worship God in just the right way with holiness and purity. And so there's a lot of excitement in the air that people have. And also, too, I think it's helpful to remember that Jesus is from the north. He's from Galilee. He's come south for the festival of Passover. So there are people that have gone out to see him that probably have never seen him before in person. So there's excitement in the air. And so I think the authorities just don't want to risk doing something like that openly in public. But of course, they're going to need some help getting Jesus in private. And that's part of the role that Judas plays in the drama of salvation here.
Right. And so let's take it a few steps forward. He's betrayed, he's arrested, he's tried. And the judgment is crucifixion, death by crucifixion. And I mean, again, we just take it for granted that this is how Jesus died. I mean, why wouldn't they, execute him in some other way? Why crucifixion?
So crucifixion was a Roman form of capital punishment, and it was used primarily for people who were not Roman citizens, as well as for slaves. I mean, it's almost kind of a joke in antiquity. I'm ashamed to say that crucifixion was the fate of slaves. People who were Roman citizens, if they were guilty of a capital crime, typically were not crucified. More ordinarily, they would be beheaded, which to us today sounds really gory, but it's a much quicker, more painless way to go. It's just one's beheaded and it's kind of over. Crucifixion is very slow, painful, and public. Could take 2 to 3 days for someone to die on a cross. The Romans would crucify people on busy roads, a crowded location. Many cities would have a kind of a regular crucifixion spot where people would be crucified either using a good-sized tree, or sometimes they might have an upright wooden column. And it was a kind of public terror. It was a way for the Romans to send a message to the people that they ruled, especially in occupied places like Israel, that you really don't want to mess with the Romans. So as one might travel into Jerusalem for a festival like Passover and go by the regular place of crucifixion and kind of remember this is where people get crucified, you might say to yourself, note to self, in the city, don't do anything foolish or end up over there. So it really is a real deterrent to what the Romans deem as inappropriate behavior, a way to kind of keep the crowd and the people in control, especially with hundreds of thousands of people being together in Jerusalem.
So is it appropriate to say, therefore, that, I mean, the Romans were trying to deter uprisings and anyone from doing anything, but those who were screaming out loud, crucify him, crucify him, were they also trying to deter anyone else from kind of making the same claims as Jesus? Was this their way of saying, let no one think that they can do the same, that or preach the same message of Jesus?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of times in kind of the popular imagination, we kind of imagine the common people, the crowds of people shouting for Jesus to be crucified. But if one really looks closely at the four gospel accounts, that's probably not the way it played out. So Jesus is arrested in the middle of the night. There's kind of a makeshift hearing in front of some of the aristocratic Jewish priests who would have some responsibility for keeping the peace and collaborating with the Romans. But they don't have the authority to crucify anyone. the Romans have to do it. So they send Jesus over to Pilate for that to happen. So those people who are later kind of shouting for Jesus to be crucified seem like they're part of the group that's been kind of plotting to kill Jesus. They don't represent the large numbers of followers that are kind of excited about Jesus. And I think, I mean, it kind of tells us a little bit about, Pilate and his role here too. He's kind of like a military commander who is running this area of Judea on behalf of the Romans. He could easily, if he thought Jesus was really no trouble or really no problem, he could have just had him flogged and that would have been the end of it, or he could have had him jailed. But he's complicit in the process. He goes along with it. He's really thinking more about himself, and he's being a bit sneaky. He's in a way trying not to take full responsibility, but he really is quite responsible for it, just as are those people who plotted to get Jesus. So there's kind of shared responsibility there.
Mm. Well, and so, okay, so let's get to the actual crucifixion. They crucify him. I mean, you go online and you can probably find pages that describe how painful, the act of being crucified was. But it's interestingly, when Jesus is thirsty at some point, they give him vinegar, right? Mm. And why on earth was there vinegar? It doesn't, I mean, unless you really study this, you don't really know why they have vinegar at the foot of the cross. Why do the soldiers and everyone else there have that with them? I can see them having water, but why vinegar?
Yeah, they definitely were not making Greek salads by the cross. That's for sure. So the reason why they had vinegar by the cross is it's part of the problem is it's not a really good English translation. So the Greek word is oxos. They gave Jesus oxos. And that's really, we have the word oxidized in English. It's oxidized wine, it's acidic wine, it's sour wine. And that was the drink of Roman soldiers. So as crucifixion could take 2 or 3 days sometimes for people to die, there would have to be soldiers there to do security, to make sure no one helped the crucified victims escape from the cross, which could happen it did happen on some occasions. So these Roman soldiers would sit around, make sure no one tried to help these victims escape, drink some sour wine, maybe play some dice, and pass the time before the victims would die on the cross, eventually kind of suffocating, their lungs collapsing, and then dying.
So they were giving Jesus what they were drinking, essentially. It's what they had. It's not like they were trying to punish him by giving him this, what we call vinegar. It was just what they had on hand.
That is what they had. I think there's probably a bit of mockery here as well. Sometimes kind of a luxurious drink in the ancient world was not only wine, but we see, for example, in Mark's gospel, he says they tried to give him at first wine mixed with myrrh. Yeah. And it's kind of a scented wine. And whether or not they had that for real, or they said this was scented wine, and then later the oxos, the sour wine, it's a way, I think, to kind of mock Jesus. Because if Jesus is being crucified for claiming that he is the king, the Messiah, we have the charge against him on the cross, the King of the Jews, it's a way to kind of add to the mockery. And
so it's in line with the crown of thorns, right? Yes. They're giving him a crown of thorns. They're giving him the drink of the king.
Yes, and it's a way of saying if you're really the king, here you go, have this. And notice Jesus refuses to drink it. He doesn't take it from them.
Wow. Okay, so we're going to be carefully then for all of these different details. And one of the details that I know many times people refer to it and many times think that this is, oh, look at this. This is a sign of Jesus being angry with God, or maybe it's actually a sign that Jesus wasn't really fully God. There's a, what he says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? So can you tell us a little bit about that and what that means?
So those are Jesus's last words in Mark's gospel and in Matthew's gospel. And it's I think we see Jesus fully human. He's fully God, but he's also fully human. And I think here we see his humanity fully on display. He is, in a way, exclaiming his loneliness, his isolation, even his sense, in a way, that God has abandoned him in some sense. It's not that he doesn't have faith in God or trust in God anymore, but he feels somehow abandoned by God. I think one more thing to kind of remember, too, is at this time in the scriptures, there's no chapter numbers or verse numbers yet in the scripture. So when Jews wanted to refer to a particular text of scripture, it was customary to refer to the first few words of a text of scripture, or the first word. So by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those are from the first verse of Psalm 22. And if you look at that psalm and you read it, it says not only the person praying this psalm feels isolated and abandoned by God, but also this feeling that this person is isolated and abandoned for the sake of other people who are afflicted on others' behalf. And the psalm ends with a cry of trust in God, and that ultimately God's salvation will be done. So it's possible Jesus might have referred to this psalm saying, I kind of feel alone and abandoned, but in the end, God, I'm doing it for all of humankind. I trust you, and in the end, I know salvation lies ahead. So it's really profound.
Is it a kind of messianic psalm in many ways, pointing to the faith and the work and ultimately what the Messiah was to do?
Yes, exactly that.
Okay, so he's crucified, he dies on the cross. We know that, and then, as we know, on Holy Friday afternoon, we celebrate the Apokathilos. He's from the cross. Joseph of Arimathea goes and asks for the body of Jesus, and we're told he buries him in a tomb. And anyone who's visited the Holy Land, of course, has been to the Holy Sepulchre and sees the actual site itself, the little space. It's not the big church, but the little crawl space you got to go into. Why a tomb and not a grave? I mean, were tombs like that common, or was this something special that was offered to Jesus?
So ordinary Jews, in other words, Jews who were not quite wealthy, would typically just be buried in a shallow trench grave in the ground, not that different than most people are buried today. Wealthy Jews, especially in and around Jerusalem, would be buried in human-cut burial caves that were hewn out of the limestone rock that's all around Jerusalem. And this was a kind of a more luxurious, a more higher status way to be buried. And these burial tombs were family tombs. So typically there would be several generations that would be buried in these tombs. They could have some slabs of stone where corpses could be laid out. And then once those slabs of stone would be filled up, typically the family would go in on the year anniversary of a person's death. They would clean the remains and they would put them in a special stone burial box that we call an ossuary. And then the family members would just kind of scribble with a rock or a nail the name of the person in the ossuary whose remains were in the ossuary. That way, you know, when Aunt Susanna goes in a year from now and starts moving around the ossuaries, you know which one is Grandpa, which one's Aunt Mary. So it was a way that higher status Jews were buried in and around Jerusalem. Why is Jesus placed in a tomb? And that's because Joseph of Arimathea takes custody of Jesus's body. He is a respected member of the council, the Sanhedrin, which is something like the Jerusalem City Council of religious leaders. And out of his respect and devotion for Jesus, he takes custody of the body and puts Jesus in such a burial tomb. We're told, the Gospels give us little different details, that it was his burial tomb, that it was a new burial tomb. And these are important details because they tell us that no one else has been placed in this tomb before. In other words, there's only one person placed in there, and there's only one person who could be missing from that tomb after the resurrection. So Jesus would have been placed in a burial tomb. It would have been sealed with a large stone, and that's to keep looters out and rodents out of the tomb. And they're quite heavy. And so we see some of the women who go to Jesus's tomb on Easter Sunday morning a bit concerned. How will this stone be removed?
Who will move this stone from out of the way? That's very interesting. I mean, I the detail of it being a new tomb. This is the first time that I'm thinking about it in this way of making sure that the evangelist is saying there was no way they confused which body was missing. There was no one else there before Jesus. This was the only body. And when it's missing, it's that body that's missing, not some other. It's not one of Joseph's family members.
Right. And the evangelists too are also very clear that some of the women who were followers of Jesus saw the tomb where Jesus's body was buried. So they know the location, they know the tomb, they know where to go, and they're
not getting the two mixed up either.
Exactly.
I mean, they're not going to the wrong tomb. Okay.
Exactly.
I mean, these are details. I mean, the evangelists, when they're writing it, they're writing these details to make a point. And I guess the person who's reading it at the time gets the message, understands it. We 2,000 years later, we just think it's a detail. It's okay. It's a part of the narrative. It's to make the story flow a little nicer, but it's actually there to make a theological point. I mean, historical and theological point. Wow. And so, all right, he's buried. And why is it, that's significant? We say, obviously, on the third day he rose from the dead. But why the third day? What's the significance of the third day after his death?
So the third day, the third day in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, is got some special significance. It's a day that's associated with epiphanies of God manifesting God's self. And also associated with God's mercy. And I give you just a real quick example. When God is going to reveal and give the 10 Commandments to Moses, God tells Moses to have the Israelites prepare themselves, to make themselves holy, to wash, to prepare. And on the third day, God will appear to Moses and give him the commandments. Isaac and Abraham, when Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, he was going to do that on the third day of his journey. But, of course, God stopped him. One other example would be Jonah. Jonah would be liberated from the belly of the whale after being there 3 days and 3 nights. So this third day has some kind of theological significance for God acting, God manifesting God's self in some marvelous way. And I think the second reason is very practical. On the third day, there can be no question that Jesus was really, truly dead. There were some people in antiquity and some people today who made the claim that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He was just unconscious, and he woke up in the tomb, and he left. Well, on the third day, it would be very difficult. He's really, really dead. He's been wrapped with burial garments. He's been sealed in a tomb with a big stone. Jesus was really, truly dead and really, truly risen on the third day.
So that's very similar to Lazarus being dead. And the detail is for 4 days in the tomb, right? Again, he was really dead.
Yes.
He wasn't just buried. He came to.
Yes.
He was dead. Okay. All right. So he rises from the dead, and then he appears to the disciples and to others for 40 days. And the Sunday after Pascha, of course, is the Sunday of Thomas. And everyone understands. Thomas asks to place his hand in the print of the nail and the side of Jesus. Otherwise, he won't believe. He wants to feel and he wants to touch. How come? When Mary Magdalene, who's the first person to actually, we're told, to see Jesus and to proclaim the resurrection, that's why she's equal to the apostles. She's the first to proclaim the resurrection. Why is it when she goes to touch him, Jesus says, "Do not touch me"? Why can't she touch him, but Jesus actually appears and lets Thomas touch him?
Yeah, it kind of seems like a double standard, but really they're two different contexts. So when Mary Magdalene encounters the risen Jesus outside the tomb in the Gospel of John, I'm sure you remember, Your Eminence, but for the sake of the viewers, she had gone to the tomb, found it empty, ran and got Peter and the beloved disciple, who came and checked and tried to figure out what the empty tomb meant. They left. She remained weeping. Two angels appear to her, and then the risen Jesus appears to her, but she doesn't recognize him. When he says her name, Mary, he recognizes her, because Jesus tells us earlier in the Gospel of John that he's the good shepherd, and the shepherd knows his sheep by name, and the sheep respond to the sound only of the shepherd's voice. So when she hears his voice saying her name, Mary, she recognizes him, and she says, Rabboni, which means in Aramaic something like, my dear little rabbi. It's a diminutive, my dear little rabbi. And probably at that moment, she either falls at Jesus' feet or she hugs him. In the Gospel of Matthew, the women fall at Jesus' feet. So she embraces him, some gesture of affection in some way. And Jesus says to her at that moment, mimu aptu in Greek. Better translation than do not touch me would be something like, do not be clinging to me. In other words, don't be clinging to the former relationship you had with me. I'm not your dear little rabbi anymore. I'm the risen Lord. So he's trying to kind of change her perception of him. And the Gospel of John, by the way, oftentimes uses these kind of double entendres, these double meanings. So do not be clinging to me. In other words, don't be holding on to me, but don't be holding on to the former relationship. So in other words, it's not the touching that's the problem here. With Thomas, he wasn't present when Jesus appeared to the group of the 12 and the others on Easter Sunday night, and he expresses his disbelief. Unless I touch the marks of the wounds, I won't believe it. So on the Sunday after the resurrection, that's when Jesus appears again and offers Thomas the possibility of touching the wounds. So it's not the matter of touching or not touching that's the problem. The issue is one of the proper understanding of who Jesus is. Because when Thomas sees Jesus, he doesn't need to touch the wounds. He realizes this is all true. Everything the disciples have been saying about Jesus' resurrection is true. And he confesses, my Lord and my God.
Well, it's a great point, because he says, my Lord and my God, then Jesus says, touch. Is that I have to look at the scriptures, but does he acknowledge and recognize him immediately? And then he says, come and put your hand in here?
Yes. And he says, you know, have you believed because you've been able to see me? Blessed are all those who have not seen and believe. And that's, I think, a really good message for all of us, right? That we may not have had a vision of the risen Jesus in the way that the first followers of Jesus, Mary Magdalene and the disciples, had, but we are also called to experience Jesus and to believe and to confess him as Lord and God without having seen him in the weeks after the resurrection.
Well, you know, I was moved for a moment when you mentioned what Mary Magdalene longed for, what she was clinging on to. And in many ways, it reminded me of what we're going through right now. And we want to cling on to, many of us want, and we desperately need what we are used to experiencing, that relationship that we have with Christ through the church services, being in church, receiving the Holy Eucharist. And it's, I know it's not the same, obviously, but it just reminded me of, you know, how we're desperately clinging on to something that we know, because we don't know what this, you know, what we're going to experience now the next few days. But it is an invitation from Jesus, I suppose, to Mary to understand that now the relationship is quite greater. It's more than just the teacher or the rabbi. It's this is your Savior. This is yeah.
Absolutely. And if I could just say one quick thing here too. I mean, in the liturgy after Holy Communion is given, we have this prayer that's recited all the time. Anastas in Christou theasamani. Oftentimes we translate it, having beheld the resurrection of Christ. I would prefer myself, having seen the resurrection of Christ. St. Simeon, the new theologian, actually asks, how have we seen the resurrection of Christ? When did we see the resurrection of Christ? And we're supposed to see it with our spiritual heart. We're supposed to experience it. So I think whether or not we're in church, which is certainly preferable, or home with our families, we have to try and experience this week Christ's death and his resurrection, and most importantly, make it our own in the way that we live.
Well, I very much appreciate that, because that's advice not only for me, but for everyone out there now throughout the world who's living this new reality. For us to internalize and experience, we can still see the resurrection, even though we're not in the church. And I have to say, Doctor, I hope and pray that I don't have to preach in front of you anytime soon. Because next time I come to your church, you have to leave when I'm giving the sermon, because I'm going to feel very inadequate. Or you have to write my sermon for me so I can make some really good points. Doctor, thank you. Thank you very, very much. I mean, I think we've had a lot of people who joined us, but I don't see any questions coming in.
Okay.
But I very much, I think you answered my questions, and I think a lot of questions that people have wanted to ask somebody for a very long time. I wish you and your loved ones continued Blessed Holy Week, and Kali Anastasi. To all of our friends and participants and our family members from across the Metropolis and beyond, I thank you again for joining us. This Wednesday, we will be joined by Deacon Perry Hamalis, another colleague of yours, and we will be talking about the bridegroom and looking at how Holy Week is a preparation for our wedding, and are we getting ready because the bridegroom is coming, and what that means for us as Orthodox Christians. So everyone, thank you very much for tuning in. Kali Anastasi to everyone. Kali Dinami. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.